Imagine marrying the most powerful man in England, and your chances of living to old age are just 33%. Two of Henry VIII's 6 wives were beheaded. One died 11 days after childbirth, and another died in exile and poverty. This isn't just unfortunate medieval marriage statistics. This is the result of a carefully designed system of terror. Why should this 500-year-old story concern us today? Because it demonstrates how absolute power creates mechanisms for destroying even the closest people. Henry VIII wasn't a madman or an impulsive tyrant. He was a calculating politician who turned the institution of marriage into an instrument of state terror. When we talk about Henry VIII's wives, we usually imagine romantic dramas or palace intrigue. The reality was far more terrifying. Each of the king's marriages was a deadly lottery, where the stakes weren't just the woman's life, but the fates of her family, friends, and even entire political factions. The 16th century in England was an era of religious wars, dynastic crises, and the formation of absolute monarchy. Henry VIII ruled from 1509 to 1547, and during this time he fundamentally changed not only the English church, but the very nature of royal power. The break with Rome in 1534 made the king not only a political, but also a religious leader of the nation. In this context, the king's wives became not just life companions, but key figures in state policy. The stability of the Tudor dynasty depended on their ability to bear a male heir. The direction of the Reformation depended on their religious views. The balance of power at court depended on their political connections. But the most terrifying thing was that Henry created a legal system that allowed him to legally formalize the murder of his wife as a state necessity. The Act of Succession of 1534 declared any doubt about the legality of the king's marriage to be high treason. The Treason Act of the same year expanded the definition of high treason to absurd limits. Imagine this. You wake up in the morning as Queen of England, and by evening you could be in the Tower on charges of adultery, based on testimony from servants who were tortured until they gave the required evidence. This wasn't paranoia. This was a real system, refined to perfection. The statistics of Henry's marriages are horrifying, even by the standards of that cruel time. Catherine of Aragon spent her final years in confinement, stripped of her title and forbidden to see her daughter. Anne Boleyn was beheaded after 3 years of marriage. Jane Seymour died from childbirth complications that could have been treatable under other circumstances. Anne of Cleves was forced to agree to divorce under threat of physical violence. Catherine Howard was beheaded at 19 years old. Only Catherine Parr survived the king, and that by a miracle. Each of these women possessed outstanding qualities: intelligence, education, political insight, or rare beauty. They weren't naive victims or unlucky adventurers. They were products of complex matrimonial diplomacy, where each marriage was planned as a state operation. However, the system created by Henry turned any of a wife's virtues into a potential threat. Too intelligent, capable of weaving conspiracies. Too beautiful, might commit adultery. Too influential, threatens royal power. Barren, useless. Bearing daughters, insufficiently useful. This system was so effective that even the king's contemporaries understood. Marriage to Henry VIII was equivalent to a death sentence with deferred execution. Diplomatic documents of the time are full of hints that European courts viewed the English king's proposals as declarations of war. But the most terrifying thing about this story isn't the cruelty of an individual tyrant, but how easily society accepted and legitimized this terror. Parliament obediently passed the necessary laws. Courts delivered predetermined verdicts. The church blessed each divorce and each execution. The nobility silently watched the destruction of women from their own ranks. How exactly did the mechanism for destroying Henry VIII's wives work? Imagine a perfectly tuned killing machine, where every cog, from court musicians to the Archbishop of Canterbury, knew their role in the spectacle called lawful execution of the Queen. The first element of the system was legal preparation. Henry didn't simply kill wives in fits of rage. Each elimination was carefully planned for months, sometimes years. The king and his advisors created a legal foundation that made execution not only possible, but necessary from the standpoint of law. Take the case of Anne Boleyn. 6 months before her arrest, the king was already consulting with lawyers about the possibility of dissolving the marriage. When it became clear that divorce wouldn't give the desired result, complete elimination of Anne and her influence, the strategy of charging her with adultery was chosen. This allowed not only executing the queen, but also declaring her daughter Elizabeth illegitimate, clearing the path to the throne for future heirs. The mechanism for fabricating evidence is striking in its sophistication. First, they obtained testimony from servants and court musicians under torture. Mark Smeaton, a court lutenist, confessed to relations with the queen only after being tortured with ropes and weights. His testimony became the basis for arresting other lovers of Anne, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The use of court ladies was particularly cynical. The system of ladies-in-waiting, which was supposed to protect the queen's honor, was turned into a network of informants. Women who shared the most intimate moments with the queen gave testimony against her under pressure or for promises of safety for their families. Lady Rochford, wife of Anne Boleyn's brother, testified against her own husband and his sister. The timeline of operations demonstrates the cold calculation of the process. Only 17 days passed from Anne Boleyn's arrest to her execution, but the preparation took much longer. Already in March 1536, Henry began courting Jane Seymour, and Anne was arrested only on May 2nd. During these 2 months, thorough legal preparation was conducted. Psychological pressure on the victim began long before formal charges. The queen was gradually isolated from allies. Her relatives were removed from court under various pretexts, and she found herself surrounded by hostile courtiers. Anne Boleyn complained in her final months that the king was avoiding her, and his new favorite was receiving gifts that had previously been intended for the queen. The role of Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, was crucial in this system. Cromwell created an effective intelligence service that gathered compromising information on all courtiers, including the king's wives. His agents infiltrated the queen's retinue disguised as servants, musicians, even chaplains. Every word, every gesture, every meeting was recorded and analyzed. The system worked on the principle of expanding circles of accusations. First, they arrested secondary figures, musicians, servants, minor courtiers. Under torture, they obtained testimony from them against more important persons. Then they arrested middle-ranking courtiers, who under threat of death testified against the queen. Finally, they arrested the victim herself, already surrounded by a dense network of evidence of her guilt. The use of religious factors was particularly sophisticated. Anne Boleyn was accused not only of adultery, but also of plans to poison the king and Princess Mary. This turned her execution into a religious act, eliminating a heretic and child killer. Catherine Howard was accused of concealing her premarital relationship, which made her marriage to the king invalid and, consequently, turned her into an impostor. The mechanism of public opinion was also refined to perfection. Before each execution, rumors about the queen's monstrous crimes spread through London. Pamphlets and ballads painted the image of a debauched woman who had deceived the good king. By the time of execution, most of the population was convinced of the justice of the sentence. Even the execution procedure was an element of psychological warfare. Anne Boleyn was beheaded with a sword, a relatively merciful execution that emphasized the king's magnanimity. Catherine Howard was executed with an axe, like an ordinary criminal, symbolizing her low birth and the severity of her crimes. Henry's system was so perfect that even wives who avoided execution were broken. Anne of Cleves agreed to divorce, not because the marriage was unhappy, but because she perfectly understood the alternative. She saw what happened to Anne Boleyn and chose safety over humiliation. The most terrifying thing about this system was its preventive nature. Wives were executed not for crimes committed, but for potential threats they might pose. Anne Boleyn was eliminated when it became clear she couldn't bear a son. Catherine Howard when her past became a political problem. This was a machine for eliminating inconvenient wives under the guise of protecting state interests. Each of Henry VIII's marriages followed an ominous script, as if the king was playing the same deadly play 6 times in a row. But the devil is in the details, and it's precisely the details that show how his system for destroying wives evolved. Catherine of Aragon was the first wife and first victim. Her story began as a political triumph. Marriage to the widow of his deceased brother Arthur in 1509 strengthened the alliance with Spain. For 24 years she was an exemplary queen, devout, faithful, politically wise. She bore 6 children, but only daughter Mary survived. The mechanism of her destruction was psychological. Henry couldn't execute the niece of Emperor Charles V. That would mean war with the most powerful state in Europe. So he chose slow torture. From 1527, the king began doubting the legality of the marriage, citing the biblical prohibition against marrying a brother's wife. Catherine refused to agree to divorce, and a 7-year war of attrition began. She was sent to Kimbolton Castle, stripped of her title as queen, forbidden to see her daughter. Spanish ambassadors reported that Catherine suspected poisoning. Her servants were dying one after another under mysterious circumstances. She died on January 7, 1536, in complete isolation, and many contemporaries were certain she had been poisoned. Anne Boleyn became the first wife executed by the new technology. Her rise took 7 years, from 1526 to 1533. She was intelligent, educated, ambitious, and refused to become merely the king's mistress. It was for her that Henry broke with Rome and declared himself head of the English Church. But Anne made a fatal mistake. She bore a daughter. Henry needed a son, and after several miscarriages, it became clear that Anne wouldn't provide one. By spring 1536, the king was already courting Jane Seymour, and lawyers were preparing a case against the queen. The speed of her fall is striking. On May 1, 1536, she attended a tournament at Greenwich. On May 2nd, she was arrested. On May 15th, the court found her guilty of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. On May 19th, she was beheaded in the Tower. On May 20th, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour represented the opposite of Anne Boleyn. Modest, quiet, conservative. She was chosen precisely for these qualities. Her family belonged to the old nobility, and she herself demonstrated complete submission to the king. But even this didn't save her from the system created by Henry. Jane died on October 12, 1537, 12 days after giving birth to son Edward. The official cause was childbirth complications, but modern historians believe her death was the result of medical negligence. The king needed a living heir, and the mother's life was sacrificed to this goal. It's telling that Henry didn't remarry for 3 years after Jane's death. Was he grieving? Unlikely. Rather, he was studying the European marriage market, choosing the next victim who could give him another son. Anne of Cleves became a victim of political calculation. Marriage to a German princess in 1540 was supposed to strengthen the alliance with Protestant German princes against Catholic powers. But the political situation changed, and Anne became unnecessary. What saved her was that she quickly understood the rules of the game. When Henry proposed divorce, she didn't resist like Catherine of Aragon. She agreed to all conditions, received generous support, and lived in England for another 17 years. Of all the king's wives, only she won this game, gaining wealth and independence. Catherine Howard is the most tragic figure in this story. She was about 19 when the 50-year-old king fell in love with her. Niece of the Duke of Norfolk, she was raised in her grandmother's house among numerous relatives and servants. Her childhood and youth were far from the ideal standards of the royal court. Her past became her death sentence. Before marriage to the king, she had romantic relationships with music teacher Henry Mannix and her cousin Frances Derham. In the 16th century, this was normal for a girl from a noble family, but became deadly dangerous for a queen. Catherine ruled for only 2 years, from 1540 to 1542. When information about her past became known to political opponents of the Howard family, she was doomed. The accusation was built not on her betraying the king, this wasn't proven, but on her concealing her premarital relationships. Particularly cynical was that Parliament specifically passed a law declaring it high treason for a queen to conceal information about her past. The law was passed after Catherine's arrest, but applied retroactively. She was executed on February 13th, 1542. Catherine Parr was the last wife and the only one who managed to survive the king, but even her story shows the perfection of the terror system. Twice widowed, she was an experienced court lady who understood the dangers of marriage to Henry. Her survival strategy was based on intelligence and caution. She became not just a wife, but a companion to the aging king, managed to establish relationships with his children from previous marriages. But even she came under investigation in 1546 on charges of heresy. What saved her was only that she managed to receive the king's forgiveness before the investigation was completed. And also that Henry died on January 28, 1547. If he had lived another year, it's quite likely that Catherine would have met the fate of her predecessors. Analysis of the timeline of each marriage shows a clear pattern. The courtship period, from several months to several years. The honeymoon, no more than a year. Then begins a phase of disappointment that can last for years. And finally, swift and cruel conclusion. Each wife went through the same stages: elevation, triumph, the king's disappointment, isolation, accusations, and final punishment. The system was so refined that there were almost no exceptions. Only those survived who either died natural deaths, Jane Seymour, or agreed to play by the king's rules, Anne of Cleves, or managed to receive forgiveness before the tyrant's death, Catherine Parr. It's time to destroy the most persistent myths about Henry VIII's wives. Popular culture has created an image of 6 failures who either couldn't keep their husband or were themselves to blame for their fate. Reality differs drastically from these stereotypes. Myth 1. Henry's wives were politically naive beauties who didn't understand what they were getting into. Absolutely false. Each of them was a product of the most complex court culture, where political intrigue was everyday life. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, monarchs who completed the Reconquista and created united Spain. She received a brilliant education, spoke Latin, French, and English, studied philosophy and theology. As regent of England in 1513, when Henry was at war in France, she successfully organized defense against Scottish invasion. Anne Boleyn spent several years at the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, then served as lady-in-waiting to the French queen. She was familiar with the latest ideas of humanism and religious reform, patronized translators of Protestant texts. Her library contained hundreds of books in Latin, French, and English. Even young Catherine Howard wasn't a simpleton, as she's often portrayed. She grew up in the house of the Duke of Norfolk, one of England's most influential politicians, and perfectly understood the mechanisms of court power. Her tragedy wasn't naivety, but that she became a pawn in the game between the king and aristocratic clans. Myth 2. Henry executed wives for betrayal and debauchery. This is justification created by royal propaganda and living to this day. The real reasons were exclusively political. Anne Boleyn was executed not for adultery. Modern historians are virtually unanimous that the charges against her were fabricated. She was executed because she couldn't bear a son and became a political burden. Divorcing her was difficult. It would have called into question the entire break with Rome made for their marriage. It's telling that of the 5 men accused of relations with Anne, 4 were executed based on testimony obtained under torture. The only material evidence, Anne's letter to Henry Norris, was interpreted as a declaration of love, though modern analysis shows it was ordinary court correspondence. Catherine Howard was accused not of betraying the king, but of concealing premarital relationships. But even these relationships weren't proven as completed sexual contacts. Moreover, at that time, noble girls often had romantic relationships before marriage. This was considered normal. The real reason for Catherine's execution was political war between the Howard clan, Catholics, supporters of rapprochement with France, and the Cromwell-Cranmer group, Protestants, supporters of alliance with German princes. Catherine became a symbol of Catholic reaction, and her elimination was a blow to her family's political ambitions. Myth 3. Henry was an impulsive tyrant who executed wives in fits of rage. On the contrary, each murder was a coldly planned political operation. Anne Boleyn's case was prepared for at least 6 months. The first consultations with lawyers about the possibility of dissolving the marriage began at the end of 1535. Parallel to this, accusations of adultery were being developed. By the time of Anne's arrest, the entire legal scheme was refined to the smallest detail. 3 days before the Queen's arrest, Thomas Cromwell had already prepared a list of her supposed lovers. Mark Smeaton was arrested a day before Anne v. Hooey, clear evidence that the operation was planned in advance. Even the execution site was chosen symbolically. Not Tower Hill, where ordinary criminals were executed, but the inner courtyard of the Tower, emphasizing the victim's special status. Myth 4. Wives themselves provoked the king with their behavior. This myth is particularly dangerous because it shifts blame from the killer to the victim. Anne Boleyn is often accused of being too ambitious and arrogant. But her arrogance consisted in demanding respect for herself as queen and refusing to silently endure humiliation. When Henry began courting Jane Seymour right in front of her, Anne allowed herself to express dissatisfaction, and this became another point of accusation against her. Catherine Howard is criticized for not telling the king about her premarital relationships. But imagine a 19-year-old girl who was supposed to confess to a 50-year-old king about past romantic relationships. In a culture where female honor was paramount, such a confession could itself become grounds for repression. Myth 5. Henry was forced to marry many times because of dynastic needs, a half-truth that conceals the sadistic essence of what was happening. Yes, the king needed male heirs, but dynastic problems could be solved in other ways. Catherine of Aragon bore him daughter Mary, a legitimate heir to the throne. European history had precedents of successful rule by women. Anne Boleyn bore Elizabeth, England's future greatest queen. But Henry declared both daughters illegitimate and excluded them from succession. This wasn't dynastic calculation, but maniacal obsession with the idea of a male heir. Moreover, after Edward's birth from Jane Seymour, the dynastic question was resolved. But the king married 3 more times. This had nothing to do with dynastic needs. It was a pathology of power, a hidden fact that few know. Henry considered the possibility of polygamy. In the 1530s, he consulted with theologians about whether it was possible to have several wives simultaneously, like Old Testament patriarchs. Only political considerations forced him to abandon this idea. Another little-known fact. The system of executing wives was so unusual that even England's allies expressed shock. Francis I of France, himself not distinguished by gentleness, called Henry a monster. Charles V publicly declared that the English king surpassed in cruelty the wildest tyrants of antiquity. The most terrifying discovery by modern historians. Henry possibly suffered from McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disease that explains both his reproductive problems and progressive personality changes. The disease causes infertility in female carriers, explaining his wife's miscarriages, and mental disorders in male carriers in mature age. If this hypothesis is correct, then Henry's wives were not just victims of tyranny, but victims of a genetic curse that doomed them to infertility and the king to madness. But even illness doesn't justify creating a state machine of terror that outlived Henry himself and became a model for future tyrants. The story of Henry VIII's 6 wives isn't medieval exotica, but a textbook on the anatomy of totalitarian terror. The mechanisms perfected by the English king 5 centuries ago were repeated with frightening accuracy in the 20th century and continue to work today. What makes this story relevant to us? Henry created the first system of state terror in history directed against the closest people. He showed how absolute power turns intimate relationships into a political instrument and love into a tool of control and destruction. Look at the patterns he established. First, romantic courtship and promises. The victim receives the highest status, wealth, influence. Then, gradual isolation from friends and family, creating an atmosphere of suspicion. Next, using close people as informants and witnesses for the prosecution. And finally, swift and cruel punishment under the guise of just retribution. Do you recognize this scheme? It was reproduced in Stalin's trials when party leaders destroyed their own comrades. It worked in Nazi Germany when the Night of the Long Knives showed that no one was protected from repression. It operates in modern authoritarian regimes, where oligarchs and officials disappear without a trace after a single careless word. But the most terrible lesson of Henry's story is how easily society accepts and justifies terror against the elite. Each queen's execution was met with popular approval, who saw this as restoration of justice. Anne Boleyn was hated as an upstart who destroyed the king's lawful marriage. Catherine Howard was despised as a debauched girl who deceived the good monarch. Henry's propaganda machine worked flawlessly. Each accusation was presented as defense of national interests. Each execution was explained as necessary to preserve the dynasty. Each murder was justified by higher considerations of state security. Sound familiar? Particularly instructive is the reaction of the intellectual elite of the time. Thomas More, the greatest humanist of the era, was executed for refusing to recognize the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. But even he didn't oppose the system as such, only the specific decision. Most educated people either remained silent or actively supported the repression. This shows how tyranny corrupts not only state institutions, but also society's moral foundations. When terror is directed against others, foreigners, heretics, political opponents, the majority is ready to support it. Understanding that the machine of repression can turn against anyone comes too late. Henry also demonstrated how absolute power distorts the very nature of human relationships. His marriages weren't unions of equals. They were deals between predator and prey, disguised as romantic stories. Each wife existed only as a function. Producer of heirs, political symbol, object of desire. When the function was fulfilled or unnecessary, the person was subject to disposal. This logic, turning people into expendable material for achieving political goals, became the foundation of all totalitarian regimes. Henry's wives were the first victims of this inhuman system. But the story of these women teaches us not only about the danger of tyranny, but also about the strength of human dignity. Catherine of Aragon insisted until her last day that she was the lawful Queen of England. Anne Boleyn, before execution, gave a speech in which she forgave the king and wished him happiness. Catherine Howard on the scaffold declared that she died as a Catholic and faithful subject. Even facing death, they maintained dignity and refused to play the role of repentant criminals that was imposed on them. This was the last act of resistance to a system that tried not only to kill them, but also to disgrace their memory. Modern research reveals another important aspect of this story: the role of gender violence in politics. Henry used his position as man and king for systematic destruction of women who somehow threatened his power. This wasn't just tyranny. It was war against female independence and influence. Each of his wives possessed qualities that made her dangerous to the patriarchal system. Catherine, political wisdom and international connections. Anne, intelligence and religious convictions. Jane, ability to bear heirs. Catherine Howard, youth and ability to influence the aging king. Catherine Parr, education and literary talents. Their destruction wasn't an accidental side effect of dynastic policy, but a conscious attempt to eliminate alternative centers of power and influence. Henry understood that strong women posed a threat to absolute monarchy and methodically eliminated them. What can we learn from this story today? First, proximity to power protects no one. On the contrary, the closer a person is to a tyrant, the more they risk. Second, public silence and indifference to others' fate inevitably turn into a threat to everyone. Third, a system that can destroy one innocent person will sooner or later destroy anyone. Henry VIII's wives didn't die in vain if their story makes us think about the nature of power and responsibility. They showed that even facing a state machine of terror, one can preserve human dignity. Their fate reminds us, freedom and security aren't given forever. They must be defended every day. The next time you hear justifications for repression based on higher state interests or see power destroying inconvenient people under the guise of fighting crime, remember the story of 6 queens. Their death should serve as a warning. Tyranny always begins with those who seem protected and ends with the destruction of all who dare to think or feel independently.